Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 171. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to the Ukraine. Hear about the other side of the Carpathian Mountains, the food, the culture, and especially some of the music. Today, the Amateur Traveler.
Heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I just have one news item for you. I'm recording this episode fairly back-to-back with the last one, so I don't have a lot of news stories, but I did want to call your attention to one that I picked up. I went to the Bay Area Travel Show this weekend, which is something I've done the last couple of years, and I did get a chance to hear Rick Steves speak, who is an author of numerous guidebooks, runs a tour company, as well as doing a PBS series. I don't know if you've had a chance to hear him. He is an engaging speaker, and I did put up on blog.amateurtraveler.com the introduction to his talk, where he talks about how he went from being a piano teacher to being a tour operator. So that's something I thought you might be interested in. blog.amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Jessica, who's coming to us from Williamsburg, Virginia, and come to talk to us about the Ukraine. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
Jessica, why the Ukraine? That's a very rare destination. Why did you go to the Ukraine?
Well, I didn't know that I wanted to go to the Ukraine until it was time to sign up for this trip. The way that I went was through a singing sort of workshop that's run through two ethnomusicologists who live in Vermont, and they run under the name of Villiage Harmony. And I always wanted to go with them to their trips to more of the Romanian side of the Eastern Bloc. Mm-hmm. To learn the folk harmony styles there of their choral traditions. But they weren't running a Romanian camp, so I chose the closest thing, which was Ukraine. I had to rush to figure out how to read Cyrillic and how to get to the Ukraine, and I ended up there not really knowing much about it, but that turned out to be fine. I had sort of a blank palette to fill up of my experiences.
And in a coincidence, I once thought about being an ethnomusicologist.
No kidding.
Well, it was about 2 minutes ago, though. But
a singer?
I am actually. So you went to learn the folk music of the Ukraine and didn't have an exposure to it before?
That's right.
Interesting.
This group, I shouldn't call them a company, they're more of a group. They're very interested in the polyphonic, like the multiple harmonies that come from folk traditions around the world and less of the refined choral traditions. And they run workshops with local experts from these countries. And so they've been to Corsica and South Africa and all over Eastern Europe. Yeah, so I ended up going to Ukraine to learn these harmonies. And they turned out to be really unique. The sound is like nothing I had heard before. I was lucky that I could sing it.
And when you say sing it, you were singing in a language you don't speak.
That's
were you learning
right.
things phonetically, or did you have to learn enough of the language to get there?
Well, our trip leaders recommended strongly that we learn how to read Cyrillic before we go. And I'd like to recommend that to any of your listeners who are thinking about going to the Ukraine, because all of the signs are in Cyrillic.
Sure.
It's pretty easy to pronounce as long as you know which letters make which sound. And so you need to be able to read which signs say Kiev, which is how the Ukrainians pronounce the name of their capital. Most people say Kiev, but that's sort of the Russian way. This is what I've heard.
Okay. All right.
And so you want to make sure, because things are a little sticky, obviously, between Ukraine and Russia right now. And so any way that you can show your appreciation of their patriotism, their newly independent country, I think is highly appreciated. So you say Kiev when you're in Kiev.
Okay. So what was the highlight of the trip for you? You mentioned the music. Any specific moment or opportunity or experience related to that?
I would really have to say being in the western part of the country. We flew into Kiev, obviously, and took an overnight train to Ivano-Frankivsk, which is sort of the capital of the western part of the country. And then we took minibuses down into the mountains, really close to the Romanian border. And I have to say, even though my Brat guidebook did talk a little bit about the Carpathian Mountains, I don't think it can be overemphasized how beautiful and sort of undiscovered and authentic it feels to be in those mountains. So that, for me, was the highlight, traveling around the western part of the country.
Okay, so you were seeing the other side of the mountains from our guest who talked about going to Transylvania.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. We're just over the hills.
Pretty on both sides, then, is what we're learning from this. And so you were in small towns, then, near the Carpathians?
That's right, I was. We went to a town called Verkhovina, spelled Verkhovyna. So Verkhovina, we stayed with homestay programs. One was sort of a large inn type of place where we didn't actually see the family until it was mealtime. Then they showed up and they fed us. And boy, did they feed us. We've talked a lot about the hospitality on this podcast. So I've heard from other guests of yours that eating is a common theme. You sit and eat some more and eat some more. And we were fed so well by this family with whom we stayed. And during the days we sang and we practiced. And we took little tours around the area to local folk singers who lived up in the hills.
And you said food being a theme. What is Ukrainian cuisine?
Well, it was heavy. I struggle with putting on weight really easily. And so I was a little worried when I went there that I was like, we're going to have all these dumplings and fried foods and the cheeses. But the funny thing is even though we ate constantly all day for 3 weeks, I didn't gain a pound. And I didn't really do that much walking around until the last few days in Kiev. The food in Ukraine is really rich and very heavy. But everything is made fresh. It's all homemade. There's no preservatives or chemicals or anything used. And I think that might have really contributed to the lack of weight gain from all these heavy foods.
Okay.
So you feel full all the time, but it didn't stick for some reason.
And a sample of the kind of thing you'd be having, a typical meal would be?
Well, my favorites were veroniki, which are boiled dumplings, sort of similar to the Polish pierogi.
Okay.
And you can have anything in a veronik. My favorites were the sweet cherries, which is sort of a dessert type of dumpling.
Okay.
Also, holubtsi, which are cabbage rolls. They're so good. These cabbage rolls are stuffed with meats and rice and other nice things and sort of boiled in like a tomato paste. And so they had sort of tomatoey gravy over them, and they were really tender. And they're large, about the size of a fist. And so you would get 2 on a plate. This was really interesting. Ukrainian cuisine is meant to share. You get small dishes, sort of like tapas
Okay.
in Spain. The appetizers are called zakuski. And so you order many, many zakuski and you sort of share them amongst friends. And those small dishes are nicely affordable, actually. When we were eating out in Kiev and in Ivano-Frankivsk, I think that one of the best reasons to travel in Ukraine right now is that everything is still pretty affordable.
Mm-hmm.
So the food is good and heavy, and you get a lot for a little bit of money.
What was your biggest surprise?
The surprise was how similar Ukrainian people look to American people. And I don't just mean the coloring, but the expressions on people's faces and just their facial structure and their body language. A lot of times, even though we were walking around these tiny little mountain towns and the clothing was really different, I could look at faces and be like, hey, I see some common ancestry here. Like I felt like they looked very American.
So it was surprisingly familiar, it sounds.
Surprisingly familiar people. I think the other big surprise that I had was how hot it was in August. We were there from August 4th to August 24th. I guess I've just had all these sort of like Russian images in my mind of the Eastern Bloc and the former Soviet countries, but it was just as sticky and hot there as it would be in Eastern Virginia where I live. And so I would advise listeners that drafts are considered really bad for you in Ukraine. And so everywhere you go, windows are shut, and especially on trains and public transportation, there's a real lack of drafts, and it's a struggle. Most of the time, windows are nailed shut. And so I would recommend buying a cheap little fan, just a little fold-out wooden fan, which we found everywhere for no more than $1. And that was another surprise. It's just how stifling it was.
So it sounds like maybe August, if you'd had a choice, perhaps more into the shoulder season might have worked out a little better for the weather.
So, yeah. Definitely bring your summer clothes. It's, for the most part, you can wear shorts. There's no sort of dress code that you need to be aware of, except for when you go into churches. Women need to cover their heads.
Okay. And let's go back to the beginning of your trip to Kiev. What did you see in Kiev, or what would you recommend that people see if we go there?
There are so many important and historical sites to see in Kiev that you should stay there for longer than I did. When we first arrived, we had just a few scant hours until it was time to get on the overnight train. But at the end of our trip, we came back and we stayed for 3 days in a compound north of the city that used to be, during the Soviet times, it used to be for music composers, interestingly enough, to stay there. And they would have lots of quiet and lots of woods to walk around in, and they could compose their music and then take day trips into the city, which is what we did. I found the Lavra, which are the famous caves and the big religious site, to actually be one of the things that I think you should give a miss if you're there at a high tourist time.
Just too crowded?
It was really crowded and hard to find your way around because of all the tourists. But my Ukrainian friend that I made, who was one of our translators, this young girl who was 18, she said that it's really a shame because when you're there during the quiet times, I'm personally not a religious person, but for the Ukrainians and the Americans who were, it just sounds like they get a lot out of it when it's more of a private time there and you can walk around, and there are underground caves which have really highly significant monks buried there. And I did go underground, and it's not sort of underground caves as you would picture. It's whitewashed walls, the floors are neatly packed, and it's glowing with candles, and you cover your head and you purchase a small beeswax candle before you go underground. And I felt sort of like I was in the way of people who were actually there to have a spiritual experience.
Sure.
Because it's in use currently. I mean, it's a pilgrimage site. So the Lavra is something to give a miss on unless you're religious, and then go when you can be by yourself.
Okay.
The funicular is another big thing in Kiev where they used to get from the lower city up to the upper city. And I actually have that on my list of something that you can probably give a miss to also, because it's so nice walking around the city. I mean, Kiev is extraordinarily walkable. There's a metro, which is also like really great. It's organized really well. It's way deep down underground, just like the ones in the Republic of Georgia and in Washington, D.C., because you have to go under the water. You take the metro way deep, and then it's a basic east-west and north-south line. So besides that, once you're above ground, I really recommend walking. And the funicular is sort of like takes you up in this subway car-esque sort of thing. And it's a really short ride. People were in line for it. And I felt like, well, we could have definitely just walked that, and it would have been much nicer. But a walk that I do recommend in Kiev is going down the Andreyevsky Uzoviv. And Andreevsky is the famous Saint Andre, who I think if you just open any guidebook about Ukraine, you can read about. So I won't go into much detail on that, but it's right now in Kiev, it's sort of a famous walk down the hill from the upper city down into the lower city, covered in like tchotchkes, just like, little kitschy things that you could buy or look at. And I saw just as many Ukrainians there as I saw obvious tourists. So it seems like a good mixing point for people to go look at funny little things and bargain with each other.
For those of you whose Yiddish is not your first language, tchotchke and trinket would be a similar word for that.
Right, neat little things. We got fake painted eggs, which are easier to travel with than the real nice painted eggs, and ex-Soviet looking hats and funny little things. So you can walk down Andreevsky Uzviv down into the section of Kiev known as Podil, which was my favorite part of the city. I highly recommend walking around Podil. It just feels a lot more residential. I almost felt like I was in Brooklyn as opposed to Manhattan. There's a lot of cafes, a lot of Ukrainians sitting around and chit-chatting and watching the foot traffic go by. And it was nicely walkable, and it felt great at the end of August to be walking around something where we weren't jam-packed.
Okay. You've named a couple misses. The home run. Don't go to Kiev and miss seeing or doing what?
Gosh, don't go to Kiev, I'd say, and miss exploring around it. I would say, Don't go and not escape for a little while, because just an hour and a half's drive in either direction will take you into the countryside. And that actually sort of lets me lead into one of the towns that we stayed in, if I can actually talk about this town. We drove for an hour and a half southeast to a little town called Kovalin. And Kovalin is so tiny, it's really hard to actually find it on the maps. But what it's close to is Pereyaslav, which is one of the most famous small Ukrainian towns sort of in the heartland. And this whole town of Pereyaslav is like a museum. There are more than 20 public museums in this town, including the Museum of Folklife and the Museum of Architecture and the Museum of all these different Ukrainian poets and philosophers and famous teachers. There's a famous Jewish writer named Shalom Aleichem, who I guess is most famous for writing the book that Fiddler on the Roof was based upon.
Okay.
And he grew up in Pereyaslav. And so there's a museum for him, and so many museums in this little town that it's really fun to leave Kiev and go out into the country where you can have a picnic and you can walk around these open air museums and really get down to small town life. I like that.
Okay.
So the town that we were staying in, Kovalin, is interesting because it's where the Chernobyl survivors were relocated. And, we could actually speak to them about that experience, because as adults, it really didn't happen that long ago. Chernobyl was in 1986. The middle-aged women, because there were very few men, it was mainly women who lived in this village, remembered keenly the astonishingly fast evacuation that they had to undergo, and all possessions had to be left because they were sort of tainted. And so the government apparently set up this town called Kovalin, and they set it up on almost like a suburban American type of grid, except no one has cars there. So it's strange to walk down these long streets with these nice, neat little driveways that were obviously set up for cars. It's like they took like a planning.
Plan.
But yeah, exactly, a Levittown sort of plan, and put these Ukrainians in it. The gardens are amazing. All these women have tried as hard as they can to quickly get their gardens resettled, even though they're from the north part of the country. Now they're down in the center of the country, and I'm sure the growing patterns are different, but they've done a remarkable job in sort of rebuilding their lives. And we stayed in some homestays there in Kovalin and just heard some really amazing stories from the women who live there about what they've been through.
The best day you had on your trip?
I think the best day happened back in Verkhovina in the Carpathians. We took a day to not rehearse and not sing and not go see any other singers and just go up into the mountains. And, I'm thinking, because I'm used to the mountains of sort of southern Appalachia, that you go up into the mountains and you just sort of walk around. And I was amazed to find, tucked away into these tiny little hollows, houses, just singular houses here, and another one there, and another one there. There's no roads going up into these mountains. There's no paths. And it was amazing. Just to every once in a while, you would see the far-off figure of someone walking down miles and miles down to this little town, where I guess they were probably going to the market or something. And so also scattered amongst these houses were altars covered altars, and that every time our Orthodox friends who we were hiking with, every time we would pass, they would stop and cross themselves. Imagine these deep, deep green pine forests, so far away from the little town, and yet there's a house, there's an altar, there's a cow, just scattered. And that hike, I think, was our best day. And I know that those hikes are written about, or at least roughly transcribed in the Brat book. If you're looking for a day hike or a 3-day hike, you can sort of find the footpaths. But it just felt so remote. It could have been 200 years ago. It could have been 400 years ago that we were up in those hills. Beautiful.
What do you wish you had known before you went?
I think I wish I had known more of the language. I found a lot of my time being spent writing things down. Okay, say that word again. I would have loved to have gotten into more deep conversations with the Ukrainians that we passed, because as a people, especially in the western part of the country, they're so hospitable. Ukrainians are known for their they'll just take care of you if you're a stranger, and they want to know all about who you are and where you come from and why you're here and who your family is and what you do. And so it was overwhelming for our translator, this poor college girl, to have to rush into the explanations. And I would have loved to communicate on my own. I think I also would have liked to have known how hot it was there in August.
Now, in terms of the language, I've only attempted one other Slavic language, and that's Russian. I found that to be a relatively difficult language to learn, especially compared to, obviously, any of the Romance languages or the Germanic-based languages, because they're different enough from English, except for the modern words. Right. Similar experience as you were trying to pick up Ukrainian?
Yes, I feel that the Slavic languages have the ease of pronunciation when it comes to their letters. This letter makes this sound only. That's it. And where our Romance languages are more confusing as far as pronunciation and letter structure goes, we have the ease when it comes to grammar. Okay. In Eastern Russia, I think the pronunciation is easy, but the grammar was so difficult to get. Just in my elementary explorations, messed up quite a bit. But the appreciation that the Ukrainians had for me even trying was really sweet.
Yep.
Because most of them wanted to practice their English. And so I didn't get many opportunities to really be in a conversation where I heard nothing but Ukrainian, because we had translators and our famous ethnomusicologist, whose name is Evgeny. And I can't say enough about the helpfulness that he brought to our trip, because he was there to teach us how to sing, but he found that he also needed to teach us how to speak. And so it was great having him around to be a go-between and just inform us of the cultural things that we needed to be aware of. And he was very easygoing, and for one man to take care of 12 American singers lost in Ukraine, it was quite a task. But he did a great job.
One warning you would give.
Don't whistle inside.
Don't whistle inside. Bad luck?
It's really bad luck. Yep, it makes money fly out the window, apparently. And especially if you're
I would be
a musician.
in such trouble.
I know, and I whistle all the time, especially we were there on a trip to learn songs, and so it was our job to get these melodies in our heads as much as we could, and we all went around singing, and it was natural inside I would start whistling and then have to clamp a hand over my mouth. Another warning would be even numbers are bad luck. So if you're going to a house, bring 1 bottle of wine or 3 bottles of wine, not 2, not 4.
Interesting.
The same goes for flowers. I don't know when you would be bringing someone flowers, but these are all sort of little tidbits that I gathered from the guidebooks that did turn out to be really true.
I recall hearing the same thing from my Russian teacher about bringing flowers in Russia as well, but I wouldn't swear to that. But
The whistling was the actual most practical warning that I would give, because they do take it pretty seriously.
Interesting. The most memorable person you met?
Pani Sofia. This is a woman who lives in Verkhovina, and she apparently is famous around the regions for being politically outspoken. And you can imagine that in Ukraine, during the last couple of decades, to be a woman, and single, by the way, unmarried, and to be politically outspoken, it's amazing that not to be crude, but it's amazing that she was there for us to talk to. And she's a singer and the writer of political satire. And so we went to her house to listen to her sing, but then the songs that she sang were so heartfelt. I mean, they've been through so much in that country. And her daughter, Oksana, has created her own section of the house into basically one giant mosaic. She's been collecting pieces of shell and pieces of pottery and pieces of broken glass and sort of arranging them this incredibly artistic way all over both floors of the house. And so if you're in Verkhovina, or at least in Western Ukraine, try to make it down to see Pani Sofia. And Pani just means Mrs. or Ms. So Mrs. Sofia and her daughter Oksana. It's not a big town. It's not a big region. I'm sure if you ask around, you'll find her. But she was so memorable in her, just the frankness with which she looked at us and she sang her songs, and we all had tears in our eyes and we didn't know what she was singing about, but it just seemed so heartfelt. And of course she set out treats for us and tea and candies, and being in her house, it was just so obvious how little material wealth anyone had in this region, and just to have that generosity and openness of spirit really meant a lot.
You mentioned that the people seemed very familiar. I'd like you to think of two moments, one that felt closest to home and one that felt furthest from home.
What an interesting question. I like this question. Let me think for a second. I actually think the time that I felt closest to home, because I've lived in Western North Carolina most of my life, in the mountains around Watauga County and Buncombe County, I think that when we were in the western part of the country and we were driving down those curvy roads, which unnerved a few people in my party, I felt like very familiar with this. Just being in the mountains, I think that mountain people have a similar vein running through them no matter which part of the world they're in.
Interesting.
So I liked being with the mountaineers of the Carpathians. Ooh, and the time I felt furthest from home, it's a public bathroom story. Is that appropriate?
Sure.
I'll keep it G-rated. In Ukraine, at least in the small towns where we were, outhouses are the mode du jour, which is great because the few sort of upscale-ish houses we went in that had indoor bathrooms, I really wished they were outdoor.
Oh my.
Yeah, the setup is not such that there is good ventilation or even good plumbing, and you can't flush toilet paper, and so anything you use has to go into the wastebasket. And so in the train station in Ivano-Frankivsk, to use the public restroom, you have to go down under the train station, and descending down into that public restroom was closely what I imagined to be like descending into hell. The smell and the just, everything you would associate with a public bathroom in a second world country. That is when I most felt farthest away from home.
Okay.
And just longing for the outhouses, let alone longing for a Western-style toilet. But these are the kind of things that we travel for. These kind of experiences bring us closer to our fellow people, and in this case, our fellow Ukrainians. It was interesting coming up out of that bathroom and saying, hey, we survived. Let's get out of here.
Now, for those people who've been looking at this show on the iTunes Enhanced versions, I imagine by now they've been seeing some of your pictures. What picture brings you back most? What picture really captured Ukraine for you?
Oh, I know. Okay, this is a restaurant photo. In Kiev, there's a restaurant that we discovered our first time in and then had to keep going back to. It was so good. We had to keep dragging more and more people there. It's incredibly cheap to go to. It's called Pid Osokom.
Okay.
And it's on Mikhailovska Street, which is really close to Independence Square, so it's sort of the heart of the city. And the picture that I'm looking at is all of us on our last day, a table full of what was our Ukrainian meal, and we've gone through every last drop of it, and our arms are around each other, and we're looking tired and full, and we've been traveling for 3 weeks and staying in different people's houses, and our clothes are rumpled, but we just look so happy and so full, and there are Ukrainians in the background who look just the same. They look rumpled and full and happy and sweaty, and it's a hot day in August, and we've just filled ourselves with boiled cabbage, and it's exuberant. I love that picture. I'll include it sort of in your show notes that I sent you.
Excellent. And as we wrap this up, you really know you're in Ukraine when what?
When you're on an overnight train, you have only managed to fill up 2 or 3 of the 4 beds in your compartment. Your new compartment buddy is a Ukrainian who speaks no English, and he's smoking, which is okay in this train car, but it's not okay to open the windows. And you're sharing the sort of spontaneous picnic of fresh tomatoes from his wife's garden, little fried fish dumplings. Yeah, I think that's when you really know you're in Ukraine, when you can share close quarters with no draft with the natives and feel happy to have good, fresh food.
And if you had to summarize Ukraine in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
I would say vast, proud, and probably fierce, and not in a violent way, but just fiercely independent, fiercely patriotic. I didn't meet a single Ukrainian person who seemed like they had to lean on anyone for anything.
Interesting. Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing with us your trip to Ukraine.
Thank you, Chris.
Finding travel resources to tell you about on the show is getting to be a little more difficult. To find things that I think are interesting, I'd welcome your suggestions. The one I have for you today is Where on Google Earth. And whereongoogleearth.net is an online geography game. It's run by a former guest on this show, came on the show and talked about Micronesia, and it presents a little slice, a little picture from Google Earth, and you have to guess where it is. There are no prizes, but if you think you're a geography whiz and you want to do that for the joy of the hunt, whereongoogleearth.net. In news from the community, unless you listen to this right after it came out and your calendar still says January 31st, 2009, it is now too late to enter the contest for What's Your Favorite City, to do a blog post for the Amateur Traveler. I'll be announcing the contest winners next week. The most rewarding comment I had probably on the show about Cuba was from a good friend, Victor Callao, who is the host of the Typical Mac User podcast and was born in Cuba, who said he had tears in his eyes as he heard us talking about walking down the Malecon in Havana. So, Victor, I'm glad you liked that show. I also heard from Jose, and Jose said, I usually hear your podcasts while I walk in the park, and I really enjoy it. As many other of your listeners, I love to hear about places I'd love to go or get ideas of new places to go that I never thought of before and remember places I've been to. I loved your podcast on Cuba last week. Next April will be 20 years since I went there with some friends, and it's amazing how your guest enjoyed his trip most like we did, especially with local people, and getting to see more than what the Cuban regime want tourists to see. We made some local friends. They took us to nightclubs for Cubans. We drank what Cubans drank. We smoked what they smoked, tobacco only. We went to the beaches Cubans go, and he had a wonderful time. At the end, we gave our Cuban friends shoes, shirts, pants, deodorant, and toothpaste. We did it 2 blocks from our hotel because they couldn't come closer. 20 years have passed and Cuba remains the same. People that are happy, but their situation in the island itself is sad. They could be a lot better, and they know it. I myself have done some travel. I've gone around Latin America, some European countries, and some other great destinations as Australia, New Zealand, Egypt, India, and Bhutan. I'd like to hear podcasts on Iceland, Greenland, or Bhutan. And I think we may actually have Jose come on and talk about Bhutan, so that's where some of the guests come from, is people like you who offer. With that, we'll bring this episode of The Amateur Traveler to a close. We won't be ending, as usual, with a theme song, but instead we'll be ending with some Ukrainian folk music. And so, as always, thanks so much for listening.